Every single morning for 8 years, Michael Chen woke up at 5:47 a.m., made instant coffee in a chipped mug, and stared at his bank account on a phone with a cracked screen. By 6:15, without fail, he would transfer $420 to an account that belonged to a woman he had never met but promised his dying wife he would support forever. $420. Every 2 weeks, rain or shine, whether he had it or not. Because that's what you do when the person you love more than breathing makes you swear on their deathbed that you'll take care of the mother who raised them, who sacrificed everything, who had no one else in this world. Michael wasn't wealthy. He worked overnight shifts, stocking shelves at a distribution center in Phoenix, Arizona. His hands were calloused, his back constantly ached, and his daughter Emma wore shoes that were half a size too small because new ones would have to wait until next month. But he never missed a payment. Not once. Not when the car broke down. Not when Emma needed glasses. Not even when the electricity got shut off for 3 days in July and they slept with all the windows open, praying for a breeze. Because Rebecca had looked at him with eyes that were already halfway to another world and whispered, promise me you'll take care of my mom. She has nothing. No savings. No pension. Just promise me. And he had. God help him, he had. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Michael didn't know, what he couldn't have known, as he watched Rebecca's chest rise and fall for the last time in that sterile hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and death, was that promises can be weapons, that grief makes you blind. That love, real love, the kind that survives beyond the grave, can be twisted into chains. And that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who know exactly how to break us. Because 8 years later, on an ordinary Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, Michael would open an email that would make him realize he had been living inside a lie so massive, so carefully constructed, that it would take federal investigators 6 months to fully unravel it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the beginning, to when Michael Chen still believed his life made sense. Michael met Rebecca Park at a community college photography class in 2009. He was 23, working part-time at his uncle's restaurant, trying to figure out what to do with a life that felt like it was stuck in neutral. Rebecca was 21, funny in a way that caught you off guard, with opinions about everything from Korean dramas to climate change. She could make instant ramen taste like a gourmet meal, and had this habit of humming old Fleetwood Mac songs while she did the dishes. They got married at City Hall with 2 friends as witnesses and celebrated with Thai food and cheap champagne. No honeymoon, no fancy reception, just 2 people who genuinely liked each other deciding that was enough. Emma came 2 years later, tiny and perfect and screaming at 3 in the morning like clockwork. Those were good years. Tight years financially, sure, but good. The kind of good where you don't realize how happy you are until it's gone. The headaches started when Emma was 4. Rebecca would squint at her phone, press her fingers to her temples, laugh it off as stress or lack of sleep. Michael suggested she see a doctor. She said she would. Weeks passed. The headaches got worse. Then came the nausea, the dizziness. The morning Michael found her collapsed in the bathroom, unconscious, blood trickling from where her head had hit the tile. The emergency room. The CT scan. The doctor with kind eyes and terrible news. Glioblastoma, stage 4. Inoperable. Maybe a year, they said. Maybe less. Rebecca was 29 years old. Michael stopped understanding how the world could be so cruel and still keep spinning. Emma asked why mommy was crying all the time. Michael didn't have an answer that made sense to a 5-year-old. He barely had one that made sense to himself. The next 11 months were a blur of hospitals and insurance forms and experimental treatments that cost more than their car. Rebecca's mother, Linda Park, flew in from Seattle. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with graying hair she kept in a tight bun and hands that never stopped moving. She took over the apartment, cooking Korean stews that Rebecca could barely eat, reading to Emma when Michael was at work, sleeping on their lumpy couch without complaint. She and Michael had never been particularly close. Linda spoke broken English, and Michael's Korean was limited to food words and basic greetings. But grief is a language everyone understands. They communicated in exhausted silences and shared looks of helplessness. Linda cried in the bathroom with the shower running so Emma wouldn't hear. Michael pretended not to notice. 3 weeks before Rebecca died, she lost the ability to walk. 2 weeks before, she couldn't remember Emma's middle name. 1 week before, she stopped recognizing Michael's face. But on that last day, there was a moment of clarity. The hospice nurse called it a rally. Rebecca's eyes focused. She reached for Michael's hand. Her grip was weak, but it was there, real, present. She said, "Take care of my mom, Michael, please." She gave up everything for me. She's all alone. She has nothing saved. No one to help her. Promise me you'll send her money. Every month. Whatever you can. Just promise me she won't be alone. Michael, throat tight, eyes burning, promised. Of course he promised. What else could he possibly say? Linda stood in the doorway, shoulders shaking, covering her mouth with both hands. 2 days later, Rebecca slipped into a coma. 16 hours after that, she was gone. The funeral was small. Rebecca had wanted to be cremated. Michael kept her ashes in a simple wooden box on the bedroom dresser. Linda stayed for another week, cooking meals Michael couldn't taste, holding Emma while she cried for her mommy. Before Linda flew back to Seattle, she handed Michael a piece of paper with bank account information written in careful, shaky handwriting. "You are good, ma'am," she said in halting English, tears streaming down her face. Rebecca was lucky. "I am lucky. Thank you. Thank you." Michael hugged her, this tiny woman who had lost her only child, and told her he would keep his promise. He would take care of her. Always. And he meant it. With everything in him, he meant it. He started the transfers the following week. $420 every 2 weeks. It was more than he could really afford, but it was what felt right, what Rebecca would have wanted, what honor demanded. Bass, and Marion said, "Dies up, fire." The years that followed were hard in ways that had nothing to do with money. Emma struggled in school, withdrew from friends, had nightmares where she called for her mother. Michael worked extra shifts when they were available, learned to cook the meals Rebecca used to make, attended parent-teacher conferences alone, and felt the weight of every other couple sitting together, whole and unbroken. He didn't date, didn't even think about it. His life was work, Emma, and the promise. Every 2 weeks. Like clockwork, the money went out. He never heard much from Linda, an occasional email thanking him, telling him about her health problems, her loneliness. He would respond briefly, asking if she needed more, if $420 was enough. She always said it was. She always said he was doing too much. But Michael kept sending it. Because that's what you do when you make a deathbed promise. You keep it. No matter what. By 2023, 8 years after Rebecca's death, Michael had developed a routine so ingrained it was almost meditative. Wake up. Coffee. Check account. Transfer money. Go to work. Come home. Help Emma with homework. Sleep. Repeat. Emma was 13 now, tall and serious, and too much like her mother in ways that made Michael's chest hurt. She wanted to go to art camp that summer. It cost $600. Michael said maybe. He always said maybe. Maybe meant he'd figure it out somehow. Cut back on groceries. Skip the car insurance payment and pray nothing happened. Take an extra shift. He'd make it work. He always did, but that Tuesday in March the routine broke. Michael woke up at 5:47, made his coffee, opened his banking app, and saw something that didn't make sense. The account he'd been sending money to for 8 years, the account that belonged to Linda Park, was empty. Completely empty. That wasn't unusual in itself. Linda was living on that money. Of course she spent it. But what caught his eye was the transaction history. Deposits. Large deposits. From multiple sources. Thousands of dollars coming in. Not just from him, but from 3 other accounts, names he didn't recognize. And the withdrawals, they weren't for groceries or rent. They were transfers. To another account. Regular. Systematic. Efficient. Michael stared at his phone screen. The coffee went cold in his hand. His brain tried to make the numbers make sense, tried to find an innocent explanation. Maybe Linda had gotten a job. Maybe she'd won something. Maybe there was family he didn't know about helping her too. But that didn't explain why the money was being moved so quickly, so methodically. Within days of arriving, it was gone again. Redirected. Hidden. Michael's hand started to shake. Not from fear. Not yet. From something else. A feeling like standing on ice and hearing it crack beneath your feet. That night, after Emma went to bed, Michael called an old friend from high school who worked in banking. Dave Chen, no relation despite the same last name, owed Michael a favor from years back. Michael explained the situation, sent screenshots of the transaction history, asked if Dave could make sense of it. Dave was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Michael, this doesn't look like an elderly woman's account. This looks like a money laundering operation, or fraud." "How well do you know this person?" Michael said. "She's my late wife's mother." Dave said, "Are you sure?" That question, "Are you sure?" It rattled around Michael's head for days. Of course he was sure. He'd met Linda. She'd stayed in his home. She'd held his daughter. She'd cried at Rebecca's funeral. But had he ever actually verified anything? Had he ever seen Linda's ID? Had he ever visited her in Seattle? Had he ever confirmed that the account actually belonged to her and not just taken her word for it because grief doesn't ask for receipts? Not. The doubt grew like a tumor, fast and consuming. Michael started digging. He searched for Linda Park in Seattle. Found dozens of women with that name, looked through social media. Nothing matched the woman he remembered. He called the phone number he had for her. Disconnected. Tried the email. bounced back. Undeliverable, 8 years of communication. And he couldn't find a single trace of her existence outside of that bank account. The ice beneath his feet wasn't just cracking anymore. It was breaking apart. And Michael was falling through into something dark and cold and incomprehensible. He hired a private investigator, a guy named Ron Castillo, who worked out of a cramped office in Tempe and charged reasonable rates because he said Michael's story bothered him. Ron did in 2 weeks what Michael couldn't do in years of blind faith. The bank account was registered to Alinda Park, yes. But the address on file was a P.O. box in Spokane, Washington, not Seattle. The social security number attached to the account belonged to a woman who had died in 1997. The phone number that used to work was a burner, long since discarded, and the other accounts depositing money into that same account. They belonged to 4 other men, widowers, all of them paying monthly support to women they believed were their late wives' mothers, all of them trapped in the same promise Michael had made, all of them funding what Ron believed was a sophisticated long-term fraud operation. But the worst part, the part that made Michael physically ill when Ron showed him the evidence, was the death certificate. Rebecca's death certificate. Ron had pulled it from county records. It was real, official. Signed by a doctor Michael remembered from the hospice. But when Ron contacted that doctor's office, the doctor had no memory of Rebecca Park. No record in his files. And when Ron dug deeper, cross-referencing databases and medical records, he found something impossible. Rebecca Park's death had been legally recorded, but her social say. Michael sat in Ron's office, staring at documents that made no sense and felt reality tilt sideways. Ron said gently, "Michael, I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that your wife didn't die, or that the woman who died wasn't your wife, or that something happened here that we don't fully understand yet." Michael couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The room felt too small. His vision tunneled. Ron got him water, made him sit with his head between his knees, told him to breathe slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth. When Michael could finally talk, he said, "That's impossible. I was there. I watched her die. I held her hand. She's gone." Ron said, "I believe you believe that. But the paper trail says something different, and we need to find out what." Michael went home that night and couldn't look at Emma. Couldn't look at the ashes on the dresser. Couldn't look at himself in the mirror. Because if Rebecca hadn't died, then who was in that box? And if she had died, then who was filing taxes under her name? And what did any of this have to do with a woman named Linda Park who may or may not have ever existed? The investigation expanded. Ron brought in a contact at the FBI who specialized in identity fraud. Agent Sarah Brennan, mid-40s, sharp eyes, no nonsense. She listened to Michael's story without interrupting, looked at the evidence Ron had compiled, said, "We've seen schemes like this before, but never one this patient. Most fraud operations want quick money. This one's been running for nearly a decade. That takes planning, infrastructure, and probably more than one person." They got a warrant for the bank records. What they found was staggering. The account wasn't just receiving money from 5 widowers. It had received money from 11 different men over an 8-year period. Some had stopped paying, presumably when they couldn't afford it anymore or became suspicious. But the operation had continued, finding new targets, refining the approach. The money was being funneled through a series of shell accounts and ultimately ending up in the Cayman Islands. Untraceable. Professional. The kind of setup that required expertise. Agent Brennan said, "Whoever's running this knows what they're doing. And they've been doing it for a long time." Michael asked the question that had been clawing at his insides for weeks. "Is my wife alive?" Brennan looked at him with something like pity and said, "I don't know. But we're going to find out." They started with the death certificate. The doctor whose signature appeared on it was real, but he claimed he'd never signed it. A handwriting analyst confirmed the signature was forged. The hospice Rebecca had died and had records of her stay, but the medical files had been heavily altered. Details didn't match. Medications listed that she'd never received, staff members who didn't remember her. It was as if someone had created a paper trail of a death that may or may not have actually happened. Brennan's team pulled security footage from the hospice from 8 years ago. Most of it had been deleted as per standard protocol, but one camera, an exterior shot of the parking lot, still had archived footage. They found the day Rebecca had supposedly died, and there, at 11:32 p.m., 16 hours after Michael had left, believing his wife was in a coma she'd never wake from, a figure matching Rebecca's description was wheeled out of a side entrance and loaded into a van, alert, very much alive. Michael watched the footage in a FBI conference room and felt his entire world collapse. That was Rebecca. He knew her shape, her posture, the way she held her head. That was his wife, alive. Leaving. While he'd been at home with Emma, trying to explain that mommy was in heaven now, Rebecca had been driven away in a van to God knows where. Brennan froze the frame on Rebecca's face, even grainy and distant. It was clearly her. Michael said, "I don't understand. Why? Why would she do this? Brennan said quietly. People fake their deaths for a lot of reasons. Deaths, abuse, witness protection, new identity. Sometimes they're coerced. Sometimes they're complicit. We won't know until we find her. Michael said, she let me think she was dead for 8 years. She let Emma grow up without a mother. She let me send money to her fake mother while our daughter went without. What reason could possibly justify that? Brennan didn't have an answer. Nobody did. The investigation moved fast after that. They traced the van's plates. Rental car, paid for with a prepaid credit card, returned 2 days later in Albuquerque. From there, the trail went cold. But Brennan's team was patient. They analyzed the money transfers, looking for patterns, found that every 6 months, like clockwork, a large withdrawal would be made from one of the Cayman accounts, always in cash, always in Miami. They staked out the bank, waited. 3 months later, in June of 2023, a woman matching Rebecca's description walked into that bank and withdrew $40,000 in cash. Federal agents arrested her in the parking lot. Her name, according to the ID she carried, was Melissa Torres, but her fingerprints matched Rebecca Park. She was 37 years old, tan, healthy, wearing expensive sunglasses and carrying a designer purse. She looked nothing like the dying woman Michael had said goodbye to 8 years ago. She looked like someone living a very comfortable life. In the interrogation room, Rebecca, because that's who she was, no matter what name she used, said nothing for 6 hours. Just sat there, arms crossed, face blank. Then her lawyer arrived, and suddenly she was willing to talk, but only to make a deal. She'd give up everyone involved in the operation in exchange for reduced charges. Brennan said no. They had enough evidence to bury her. Rebecca smiled, and it was a smile Michael wouldn't have recognized, cold and calculating, and said, "You have evidence I faked my death and committed fraud, but you don't have the person who planned it. You don't have the doctor who falsified records. You don't have Linda Park, and you never will, unless I help you." Brennan leaned back in her chair, considered this, and said, "Tell me why. Why fake your death? Why put your husband and daughter through that?" Rebecca's smile faded. She looked down at her hands, at the wedding ring she was no longer wearing, and said, "Because I wanted out, and this was the only way." She told them everything. How she'd met Linda Park, whose real name was Catherine Bowen, at a cancer support group. Catherine wasn't sick. She was recruiting, looking for women who were dying or willing to pretend to be, who had families that loved them enough to make promises. Rebecca had been genuinely sick, genuinely scared, genuinely facing down a terminal diagnosis. But Catherine offered her an alternative. A doctor who could fake the final stages, a hospice stay that would be real enough to convince everyone, a death that would be documented and believed, and then a new life, funded by the guilt and love of the family left behind. All Rebecca had to do was play her part, disappear, and never look back. In exchange, she'd get treatment. Real treatment. Experimental therapy that wasn't covered by insurance and cost more than Michael could earn in 5 years. Catherine had connections, offshore accounts, resources, and Rebecca, terrified and desperate, and not wanting to die at 29, said yes. The treatment worked. The tumor shrank. Rebecca survived. But the deal meant she could never go back. Never contact Michael. Never see Emma. Catherine had made that very clear. The moment Rebecca broke character, the moment she reached out, the whole operation would collapse, and Rebecca would lose everything. So she stayed dead, lived in Florida under a fake name, worked cash jobs. Saw her daughter grow up through Facebook photos Michael posted, never commenting, never liking, just watching from a distance like a ghost. And every 2 weeks, like clockwork, Michael's money arrived, funding the life Rebecca had chosen over the family she'd abandoned. She told Brennan all of this with a flat, exhausted voice, like she was confessing something she'd been carrying for too long. When Brennan asked if she regretted it, Rebecca was quiet for a long time. Then she said every single day, "But I'm alive." That was the trade. Catherine Bowen was arrested 3 days later in Vancouver. She was 62 years old, a former nurse, and had been running variations of this scheme for over 15 years. She had files on dozens of families, scripts for the perfect deathbed promise, contacts in medical records offices, a network of people willing to forge documents for the right price. She'd made millions, lived in a penthouse, drove a Mercedes, and felt absolutely no remorse. In her interrogation, she said, "These men wanted to feel like heroes. I gave them that opportunity. They wanted to believe they were honoring their wives' last wishes. I made that possible. I didn't force anyone to send money. They chose to. That's not fraud. That's just good marketing." Brennan looked at her with open disgust and said, "You exploited grieving families. You manipulated people at their lowest point. You helped women fake terminal illnesses and abandon their children. That's not marketing. That's evil." Catherine shrugged. Call it what you want. I call it a living. Michael was offered the chance to see Rebecca before her trial. He declined. Agent Brennan asked if he was sure. He said, "The woman I loved died 8 years ago. I don't know who that person is in that cell, but she's not my wife." Emma, now 13 and old enough to understand some of what had happened, asked if she could see her mother. Michael said, "That's your choice. I won't make it for you." Emma thought about it for 2 weeks. Then she said, "No, if she wanted to be my mom, she would have stayed. I don't need to see her." Michael held his daughter and felt proud of her in a way that hurt. She was stronger than he'd ever been. The trial happened in federal court, over the course of 6 weeks. Rebecca pleaded guilty to fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Catherine Bowen was sentenced to 28 years. The other women involved in the scheme received varying sentences depending on their level of involvement. Michael attended the sentencing, sat in the back, watched Rebecca in an orange jumpsuit, looking small and scared and nothing like the woman he'd married. She looked at him once. He looked away. The money was recovered. Most of it. The government seized Catherine's assets, liquidated her accounts, and returned what they could to the victims. Michael received a check for $34,000, 8 years of payments minus legal fees and what couldn't be recovered. He stared at that check for a long time. Blood money. Grief money. The price of a promise made to a ghost. He used it to pay off debt, to fix the car, to buy Emma new shoes, new clothes, the art camp she'd wanted. He put the rest in a college fund. He didn't keep a single dollar for himself. It didn't feel like his. It felt like evidence of the biggest mistake of his life. Trusting. Believing, loving someone so much that you'd do anything they asked without question. He didn't know how to reconcile the Rebecca he'd loved with the Rebecca who'd done this. So he stopped trying. He packed up her ashes, the ones that didn't belong to her, and gave them to the FBI. They were testing them, trying to identify the actual person, some other family's tragedy, some other lie. Emma asked him one night, lying in bed before sleep, if he was angry at Mommy. Michael said, "I don't know what I am, sweetheart. Sad, mostly. And tired." Emma said, "I'm mad at her. Is that okay?" Michael said, "That's more than okay. You get to feel however you feel." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think she ever loved us? Like really loved us?" Michael's throat went tight. He wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that the woman who had hummed Fleetwood Mac and made instant ramen special had been real, that the love had been real even if everything else was a lie. But he didn't know anymore. So he said, "I think she loved us the best way she knew how. And I think she made a choice that hurt us because she was scared. People do terrible things when they're scared." Emma nodded like that made sense. Then she said, "I'm glad she's not dead, but I kinda wish she was." Michael didn't know what to say to that, so he just held his daughter until she fell asleep. Michael Chen still wakes up at 5:47 a.m. Still makes instant coffee in a chipped mug. But he doesn't check his bank account anymore. Doesn't send money to anyone. He goes to work. Comes home. Helps Emma with homework. They started going to therapy together, trying to untangle the knot of grief and betrayal and confusion. It helps. Slowly. Some days are harder than others. Some days Michael still reaches for his phone out of habit, ready to make the transfer, before he remembers there's no one to send it to. That the promise was built on a foundation of sand. That love, even real love, can be weaponized by people who know exactly which strings to pull. He's learning to forgive himself. Learning that being a good man doesn't mean being a doormat. Learning that promises made to ghosts don't count. There, Becca. Emma is thriving now. She got into that art camp, made friends, started painting again, something she hadn't done since Rebecca left. Her work is dark sometimes, full of shadows and empty spaces, but it's honest. Michael hangs every piece on the fridge. Last month, a journalist reached out, wanted to write a story about the scheme, about Michael's experience. He said no. This isn't a story he wants to tell the world. It's a scar he's learning to live with. But if there's anything he wants people to understand, it's this. Grief makes you vulnerable. It opens you up in ways that can be beautiful or devastating or both. And there are people in this world who see that vulnerability and exploit it, who take your love, your honor, your promises, and twist them into profit. They're counting on you not asking questions, on your guilt being stronger than your doubt, on your need to believe being greater than your need to verify. Don't give them that power. So here's the question for you, wherever you are right now, watching the story unfold. Have you ever made a promise you kept without question? Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you never thought to verify their story? And if you found out tomorrow that the person you'd been helping, supporting, sacrificing for was not who they claimed to be, how would you handle it? Would you be angry, heartbroken, relieved? Think about the promises you've made, the people you've committed to, and ask yourself, are you keeping those promises out of love or out of guilt, because there's a difference, and that difference matters. Michael Chen learned that the hard way. He spent 8 years honoring a ghost. 8 years sacrificing for a lie. 8 years putting someone else's manufactured guilt above his own daughter's needs. He's not angry anymore, mostly. He's just sad that love, the realest thing he'd ever felt, could be so easily twisted into a cage. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel or question, leave a comment below. Tell us what you would have done in Michael's place. Would you have kept sending the money? Would you have investigated sooner? How do you balance honoring someone's last wishes with protecting yourself and your family? These are hard questions. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you found value in this story, if it made you see something differently, consider subscribing. We tell stories like this because they matter. Because the truth, even when it's ugly, is worth knowing. Because sometimes the most important lessons come wrapped in the hardest experiences. Michael's story isn't over. He's still writing it. Every morning at 5:47, one day at a time. But now he's writing it for himself and for Emma, not for a promise made to a ghost. And that makes all the difference.